Hey there, neighbor. I'm probably going to lose some man points for this, but I can't watch horror movies. At all. It goes back to when I was about 6 years old and my creepy uncle made me watch a horror movie and I saw a man get ripped in half. Nowadays, gore will quite literally turn my stomach. I'll throw up if I see too many people die in horrific ways. So it's kind of bizarre that some of my favorite games would be horror games. And today, we're going to go back to where it all started. The granddaddy of them all. The Resident Evil series. The Resident Evil series is one of my favorite game franchises ever. In the future, I plan on doing many, if not all, of these games. But for now, we're going to take a look at the entire series, and you can expect some spoilers. But first, a little history. Survival horror games have been around since, well, Resident Evil. When the game came out in 1996, it was the first time the term survival horror had ever been used. Since then, they've applied the term to games as far back as Haunted House for the Atari 2600. Horror had been a part of games for years, though. Like The Seventh Guest, Phantasmagoria, hell, even Castlevania could be considered a horror game. But survival horror is different than just having horror elements. The player character is vulnerable, weapons and ammo are scarce, and you typically need to find items and solve puzzles to proceed from one area to the next. Here's the general gist of playing a survival horror game. You're a cheerleader who just had sex in a horror movie. Survive until the end credits. Good luck, asshole. The first 3D survival horror game was probably Alone in the Dark, which came out in 1992. I might cover that game in a future Retro Recon video someday, but that's enough history for now. Let's play some Resident Evil. And I suggest we start where it all started. Resident Evil for the PlayStation. The first game came out in 1996, and it was a smash hit. You play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, and they each have their own abilities and storylines, essentially making it 2 games in one. The game opens with an FMV featuring live actors, and after the awesomely cheesy roll call and title,
Resident Evil,
the game begins, and you're introduced to what is quite possibly the worst voice acting and game dialogue ever.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you. That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
The game utilized 3-dimensional characters and enemies in front of 2-dimensional backgrounds. Players would be tasked with exploring a spooky mansion infested with zombies and other mutated creatures, while solving puzzles which would inevitably open up more of the mansion. With the assistance of Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, and Albert Wesker. Players must try to discover the secrets of the Umbrella Corporation and escape, while saving everyone they can. This is the only game of the series to feature multiple endings, depending on how many people you save and whether you destroy the mansion or not. Different scenes could be seen if you made different choices about where to go or in what order you do things. Combat wasn't always a focus. In fact, players soon found they were better off evading enemies wherever possible, as ammo was limited and hard to find. And the game frequently did its level best to scare players, either with jump scares, or with enemies the player would be reluctant to face. The sharks still scare the crap out of me. The first Resident Evil was an amazing game that redefined what an adventure game could be. And a game this awesome deserved an incredible sequel. And it got one. Resident Evil 2 was released in 1998, and it was set 2 months after the events of the first game. The zombie outbreak had now consumed the nearby town of Raccoon City, and newcomers Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield find themselves ensnared in a nightmare. Once again, you could choose between playing either of them, and while there were fewer gameplay differences between characters this time around, it made a world of difference to the story. You see, finishing a game you started with one character would unlock a second scenario for the other, allowing you to see the story from the other character's perspective, and which character you chose to play as first would completely change the way the story plays out. This wasn't just 2 games in one, it was 4 games in one. The game introduced the series' first child character, Sherry Birkin, and featured much, much better voice acting and dialogue, though it wasn't without occasional cheesiness.
I'm not letting anyone leave my town! Everyone's gonna die!
The music is brilliant, one of my favorite soundtracks of the series. Combined with the atmosphere, unlockable extras, fun characters, nightmarish twists, turns, and surprises, Resident Evil 2 is my favorite game of the series and one of my favorite games of all time. So it probably came as no surprise to anyone when another sequel was announced. But would it be as good as the first 2? Not really. But Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is still a solid entry in the series. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released just 1 year later in 1999, and it can't really be labeled a sequel or a prequel, it's sort of both. The first half of the game takes place 1 day before the events of Resident Evil 2, and the second half of the game takes place 1 day after those events. This time you can only choose to play one scenario, as you attempt to guide Jill Valentine out of Raccoon City safely. But, like the first game, the story will change depending on what choices you make, though this time those choices are clearly marked. At several points during the game you'll need to make quick decisions between 2 options. Resident Evil 3's subtitle, Nemesis, isn't just for show. He's a bioorganic weapon programmed to hunt down and kill the remaining members of STARS, which explains why he sometimes sounds like a young child in a planetarium.
Stars.
Sorry, I meant a young child in a planetarium who has some sort of throat infection.
Stars.
Unlike previous enemies, Nemesis will actually chase you down. Running into a new area will not necessarily save you. Nemesis will follow you and can open doors, so you either need to run far enough and fast enough to lose him, or you have to stand and fight. A dangerous option under even the best of circumstances. Despite the first iteration of the recurring series minigame Mercenaries mode, several gameplay improvements such as a dodge move and the quick 180 turn, and 8 unlockable epilogue files, I didn't like Resident Evil 3 as much as the first 2 games. In fact, it would probably be my least favorite Resident Evil game on the PlayStation, if it hadn't been for this CD-shaped turd. Resident Evil Survivor was shat out in 2000 and Capcom forgot to flush. The main character survives a helicopter crash on a secluded island and wakes up with, everybody say it with me now, amnesia, and has to figure out who he is and what happened here. 5 minutes into the game you'll realize he's the only one who cares. The gameplay takes place from a first-person perspective, and the Japanese and PAL versions of the game allowed you to use a light gun controller to shoot. But for some bizarre reason, that functionality was taken out of the American release, so you wind up having to aim with the D-pad, and that's a smoking log of shit. The story, voice acting, and dialogue are atrocious.
Vincent? Who's that? Wait. Am I Vincent?
In the first Resident Evil, the bad voice acting was sort of amusing. It had a certain charm.
Just as I thought.
But here, it's just unbearable.
No. This is me. I am Vincent. It was all my fault.
Ugh. Stay away from Survivor. It's horrible. The prospect of playing it again is scarier than anything actually in the game. But as time moved on and technology improved, Capcom would return to the old formula on new systems, with Resident Evil Code Veronica on the Dreamcast and Code Veronica X on PlayStation 2. Code Veronica was released in 2000 and was the first game in the main series to use full 3D backgrounds instead of pre-rendered two-dimensional backdrops. This meant, among other things, that the camera could now move. Gameplay has remained largely the same as in Nemesis, though the dodge move is gone. Once again, there is only one scenario to play through. You play as Claire Redfield, who was captured by Umbrella during an attempt to infiltrate their headquarters and sent to a remote island. The game certainly had memorable characters, like the phenomenally irritating Steve Burnside.
You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
Or the wonderfully batshit insane Alfred Ashford.
Have it your way, then. You're just a rat in a cage anyway. I'll be sure to keep you entertained before I dispose of you. I so want to enjoy this.
But most notable is the return of an old enemy.
Let's just say that I'm a ghost, coming back to haunt your dear brother.
Wesker. The game was good. Classic Resident Evil gameplay with a 3D facelift, but with the sole exception of the weird and psychotic Alfred Ashford, there just wasn't anything terribly memorable about it. It was more action-oriented and linear than previous installments, but it's still a solid game. We're not even halfway done, so I'm gonna keep right on trucking with what is quite possibly the best remake in the history of video games, the Resident Evil remake for the GameCube. Capcom took the original Resident Evil and gave it one hell of a makeover for the GameCube in 2002. The game looks incredible. It features near photorealistic pre-rendered environments with the brilliant use of FMV to make everything come alive, from a wavering light source to wind blowing through the trees. The gameplay has been upgraded to include the use of defense items that allow you to escape being grabbed by a zombie. The script has been rewritten to have a more serious tone, and the voice acting has been highly improved as well. The mansion is darker, and there have been new, twisted areas, traps, and enemies added, and most of the puzzles from the original game have been changed. This is a game that should be played at night. In my opinion, it's the scariest Resident Evil game. As for whether it's better than the original, I can't say. The original was much like a B horror movie, campy, silly, capable of scares, but not meant to be taken seriously. The remake is more like a good Stephen King novel, much, much scarier, and absolutely meant to be taken seriously. I like them both, so which one I'll play depends on which experience I want. The remake was fantastic, but Capcom was far from done with the GameCube. They decided they hadn't gone back far enough, and released a prequel, Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 was released in 2002, just 6 months after the remake, and it follows Rebecca Chambers and escaped convict Billy Cohen as they try to survive the outbreak in the area surrounding the original game's mansion. The story fills in a lot of the backstory surrounding the overarching plot, particularly the actions of the Stars Bravo team before the events of Resident Evil 1. Even though there are two main characters, you don't choose between them. You control them both, switching between them at will. The entire game revolves around this mechanic, with many puzzles requiring characters to split up or juggle items. Like the original game, the two characters have different abilities. Rebecca can mix herbs and get into tight spaces, while Billy can take more damage and move heavy objects. The game is a solid entry in the franchise, but by this point the Resident Evil formula was getting stale and predictable. This is one of the few Resident Evil games I've never beaten, simply because I've never been able to get into it for very long before I lose interest. Meanwhile, PlayStation 2 owners were upset that GameCube was getting all the love. How come we don't get any Resident Evil exclusives, we asked. And then Capcom said, alright, how about Resident Evil Dead Aim? Well, fuck you too, Capcom! Resident Evil Dead Aim was released in 2003, and it was the fourth game in the Gun Survivor series in Japan. I guess Japan has a bigger bullshit tolerance than I do. In any event, it's a light gun game mixed with a pseudo-Resident Evil plot and movement controls. It's just bizarre. The shooting's kind of fun if you're using an actual gun con, but I'm forced to use a regular controller here because the gun con won't work on my high-def TV. So that's a double helping of shit sandwich. I can see what they were trying to do here, but it never quite feels right. It doesn't help that the main character, Bruce McGivern, is an arrogant dick cheese, and his frenemy, Fong Ling, isn't all that much better. It feels like they were trying to recreate the kind of relationship that Leon and Ada had, only they forgot that Leon and Ada were both likable. Capcom would eventually try to make it up to PS2 owners with another exclusive that experimented with online play and co-op gaming: Resident Evil Outbreak. Resident Evil Outbreak was released in 2004 and featured online cooperative play for the first time in the series, but players have the option of playing solo, which is fortunate because the servers have been shut down for years. You can choose one of 8 characters, all of whom have a special skill of their own, and try to survive one of 5 different scenarios with the assistance of 2 AI partners. The scenarios are all shorter than a standard Resident Evil campaign. You can get through them in half an hour to an hour or so. The game suffers for a number of reasons. First, going into your menus or reading something doesn't pause the game. You can get attacked while you're trying to read a note someone left. So what little there is of a story you're generally going to skip just because it's safer. Secondly, the load time is ridiculous. The one thing I will definitely say in its favor, the intro is one of the most memorable in the series' history. Resident Evil Outbreak isn't bad, it's just not very good. Resident Evil was getting a drubbing from fans and critics alike, and it would take something experimental and visionary to breathe new life into the franchise. Enter Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 was released for the GameCube in early 2005. It brings back Leon S. Kennedy as he tries to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, from a cult hideout in rural Spain. The game is entirely in 3D, and instead of constantly changing preset camera angles, the camera hovers just over Leon's shoulder. Players can now precisely aim their shots, putting bullets in faces, knees, crotches, wherever they'll do the most damage. The Umbrella Corporation is finished. The zombies of the previous games had been replaced with Ganados, smarter, stronger, and scarier. Dr. Salvador is one of the scariest enemies in any game ever. The action had been ramped up considerably. The inventory system had been completely revamped with the genius attaché case setup. The story and dialogue were once again rather campy and silly, and the weapons could all be upgraded and modified with attachments. The only real criticisms I have for the game are that Ashley can get annoying from time to time. And oh yeah, this is the introduction of the series to the bane of my existence, quick time events. I hate this bullshit. Unfortunately, ever since this game, they have infested Resident Evil like a plague of leeches, and all I want to do is find whoever at Capcom is responsible for them still being used and introduce him to the business end of Dr. Salvador's favorite surgical tool. Despite the quick horseshit events, Resident Evil 4 was and still is an awesome game, and it was a huge success. But Capcom wasn't quite done with the old way of doing things. Just 3 months later saw the release of Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2. File Number 2, like the first game, was made only for the PS2, and it improved some things that were wrong with its predecessor, but not everything. Load times were decreased, but you still can't take any time to read anything or manage your items. They apparently overhauled the online play, and there were 5 new scenarios to play through, but otherwise, the game just feels like more of the same. It would be 2 full years before we'd see another Resident Evil title, and it would end up being on the Wii. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. I have the PlayStation Network version. It's downloadable. There's no box or disc. The Umbrella Chronicles was released for the Wii in 2007, and on the PlayStation Network in 2012. The game is a rail shooter using the Wiimote or the PlayStation Move as a light gun, and for the first time, a Resident Evil light gun game is actually pretty fun. While the game does proceed on rails, you are given choices of multiple paths, and the game features a weapon upgrade system that, while nowhere near as deep as Resident Evil 4's, does increase the replay value quite a bit. The game is a retelling of the events of Resident Evil 0, 1, and 3, and in doing so it rewrites a little bit of Umbrella's past while filling in some bits and pieces. It's enjoyable, but nothing too special. Oh, and it includes QuickTime fuckers. Damn it, I hate those things. Well, I'd better buckle down because we've still got more to come. Resident Evil 4's success guaranteed that there would be another main series sequel, and eventually we got one. Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 was released for the PS3 and the Xbox 360 in 2009. It features Chris Redfield and his new partner Sheva Alomar as they journey across Africa trying to stop a bioterror plot. The game again featured an over-the-shoulder viewpoint and precision aiming in gunplay, and could be played cooperatively online or off. The action has again been ramped up, this time to near ridiculous levels, and puzzles are almost non-existent. Resident Evil 5 does not lack for colorful characters. Irving looks like a young Eddie Izzard and talks like a New York City thug, but he has the best line in the game.
Shit! I just had an extreme makeover! Ah!
Excella Guione? Damn. Resident Evil's bringing sexy back. And of course, everyone's favorite villain returns.
You have.
Whiskers. Meow. Meow, 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 meow. Meow, meow. Umbrella. Meow. There were allegations of possible racism, what with having a white guy mow down tons of black people, but come on, get serious. It's not like Capcom would depict the African people as wearing grass skirts and wielding spears, oh my god. Racist or not, the game was fun, and it was awesome to finally be able to have a friend over and play the game in co-op, but it didn't really feel like a Resident Evil game. The plot, unlike RE4, takes itself way too seriously and pushes the absurdity nearly out of bounds. Combat is the clear primary focus. Most levels are less about exploring and finding your way out, and more about killing everything in your way and getting to the end. This game has more in common with Contra than it does the first Resident Evil. And oh yeah, once again, there's a heavy reliance on fuck-time events. Resident Evil 5 still sold well despite its deficiencies, so fans knew there would be more coming. To tide us over until the next main installment, we got a sequel to the Umbrella Chronicles, Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles. Also owned as a downloadable title. Look, I'm just not going to be able to hold everything up for the camera, okay? The Dark Side Chronicles was released in late 2009, and it's another rail shooter featuring Leon and Krauser on a mission in South America, sporting a new locale, characters, and story. Krauser asks Leon about his past, which leads to an on-rails retelling of the stories of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica, which had both been conspicuously absent from Umbrella Chronicles. There have been some minor upgrades that make this a better game than Umbrella Chronicles, and it was so nice for Resident Evil 2 to finally be remade in some form, but otherwise, Dark Side Chronicles is really just more of the same. Resident Evil's on a roll, but it's been a while since they've released an absolute turd. They're about due for one, and right on cue, there's Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. Operation Raccoon City was released in early 2012, and it's a non-canon hypothetical scenario surrounding Umbrella's Special Ops mercenaries. It's a squad-based action shooter, and it's awful. The controls feel awkward, the aiming is loose, the characters are all completely unlikable, the action is unsatisfying, the levels are really poorly designed, the AI is dumb as a box of rocks, the PC version I have crashed on me multiple times, and the icing on the shit cake? Quick shit, fuckers! I bought this game on sale for $12.50 and I still feel I got ripped off. Stay away from this game unless you really, really want to be able to kill Leon S. Kennedy for some reason. Even then, I'd say just load up Resident Evil 2 and let him get eaten by zombies. Finally, there's the most recent iteration in the series, Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 was released in late 2012, and it's a third-person shooter. You'll notice I didn't classify it as a survival horror game. Well, it's not one. Capcom doesn't even call it that. They call it dramatic horror. There are multiple campaigns to choose from, and they all interweave with each other in a way that reminds me of the original Resident Evil games. Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, and even Sherry Birkin returns, though Sherry's decidedly grown up now. In more ways than one. The action has been raised to absurd heights, as all the characters have an array of melee attacks available for use at any time, though this is relieved by the fact that the controls are excellent. You can finally move and aim using both analog sticks, and you can finally move while aiming and firing. The graphics are superb, and the soundtrack is a tie with Resident Evil 2's soundtrack for the best in the series. And it's still a fun game to play with a friend, for the most part. But there are some things I didn't like. There are no puzzles in the game whatsoever, so any sense of mental challenge is gone. The plot is even more batshit insane than Alfred Ashford. There are plot holes big enough to fit a zombie-driven tanker truck through. The characters are all superheroes who take enough damage in cutscenes to kill busloads of people, and there's absolutely zero penalty for dying. And oh yeah, one more thing. There are fuck shit fuckers!
Now you might think we're done, and you'd be wrong. I think you've forgotten about the movie. What? No, not that one. I watched the first one and I made it as far as the laser room before I finally got physically ill. And I didn't really think much of the movie as a whole. On the other hand, I really enjoyed Resident Horror.
Resident Horror was made by X-Strike Studios, the same gang that made River City Rumble. And that movie was good, but this is awesome. The jokes and setups are great, though there are some that you'll only get if you're familiar with the Resident Evil games. The characters are quirky, the special effects range from bad to worse, though there's one monster that's actually rather impressively well made. This is an awesomely cheesy B-horror movie, which is exactly how the first Resident Evil felt. They sell the DVD on their website for $10 plus shipping, and in my opinion it's worth every penny.
That's everything. Everything I own, at any rate.
Keep in mind, I'm aware there are more Resident Evil games I haven't covered, like Resident Evil Gaiden for Game Boy Color, Deadly Silence for the DS, and Mercenaries 3D and Revelations for the 3DS. But I'm limited to what games I actually own. Maybe someday I'll be able to add them to this review and update it.
So, with all of that being said, what's my favorite memory of the series? That would have to simply be sharing it with people.
I have many fond memories of playing these games with my best friend Jorge or my father just watching and offering helpful advice. Hell, when I got Resident Evil 4 for my PS2, Jorge and his then girlfriend would come over just about every other day and watch me play my way through it. And then Resident Evil 5 came out and we were finally able to play together. Hell, to this day I can still bring a Resident Evil game to my parents' house and my father will enjoy watching me play it. I really enjoy showing it to people. Whether it's cheesy or scary, Resident Evil is always entertaining. Almost.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this trip down a zombie-infested memory lane. Remember to check out X-Strike Studios and their brilliant video game parody movies. They've also got a YouTube channel that's highly entertaining. You can find the link for that below. For now, I've got more memories to make.